Okay, my name is Shelby with a C, and I got introduced to the world of comedy in kind of like a really weird way. I actually broke my leg when I was in high school, and I was doing it, or I broke my leg in the nerdiest way possible, playing Ultimate Frisbee. And yeah, I was like just really upset and sad, and because I was alone all day, I was watching so much TV, and all of a sudden this documentary came on about this comedian named Richard Pryor. And oh my god, okay, so they said he was like the most prolific comedian of his time, and he's literally from like 40 minutes away from where I'm from in Chicago. And I was like, oh my god, I'm literally like obsessed with him. And from there, I got like very interested in comedy history, and now comedy science. So, and that it makes a lot of sense because we laugh because our brains release these neurotransmitters called endorphins, which are often called the body's natural painkiller. So that's kind of where the phrase "laughter is the best medicine" comes from, because laughing can often mimic the same effects as medicine sometimes. And from there, I started working at like these really cool places, and I met my comedy hero Conan, and intern at SNL, and last night at HBO, met Stephen Colbert, and now I'm an assistant at Nickelodeon. So essentially, a lot of my life has been in observation of comedy. So I decided to split this talk up into 4 different sections, studying the science of working solo, the science of subversion, the science of shock, and the science of survival. So, to examine the science of working solo, we're going to be looking at the comedian George Carlin. And so George Carlin was born in the 30s right here in New York, but he was born in Manhattan, which is also known as the very first place to ever have a stand-up comedy club. So this is called the Improv New York, and it was on 44th Street and Broadway, and it doesn't exist anymore, but this was a very historic building at the time. But comedy at the time was very restricted, though. It wasn't like today where you could say whatever you want. For example, this is the show I Love Lucy from the 1950s, and Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, they were literally married in real life and on the show, but they could not sleep in the same bed. Like, this is a photo of their bedroom, but it was inappropriate to show them in one bed on television. And then the show All in the Family came out, and in 1971 they featured the very first sound of a toilet on television, because you could not talk about bathrooms on TV. And at the time, George Carlin, he followed these same rules. Like, this is what you were supposed to look like when you perform stand-up comedy. But he kind of changed his style in 1972 when he released his comedy album, Class Clown, and his prolific bit, The 7 Words You Can't Say on Television. It's very explicit.
It seemed to indicate that somebody was awfully interested in these words. They kept referring to them. They called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse, in poor taste, unseemly, street talk, gutter talk, locker room language, barracks talk, bawdy, naughty, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of was shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits.
So this is a year after the first toilet was heard on television. And they literally sent him to jail, like after this performance. This is the Milwaukee Police Department escorting him out of the arena on the grounds of public indecency. And the case actually made its way to the Supreme Court, and it was like a really big deal. And this touches on like a very important aspect of stand-up comedy, which is the possibility of social rejection. And so social rejection activates what's called the dorsal anterior cingulate in the brain, which is also activated when we experience physical pain. So like if you say a bad joke at work and you're like, oh my God, I want to die, that's your brain literally reacting to you being ostracized from your community. And so that's why comedians are like so awesome, but it all worked out for George Carlin because literally a few years later, he was asked to host a a new TV show at the time that came out in 1975 called Saturday Night Live. So he was like the very first host of SNL. Okay, now the science of subversion. This is Jackie Moms Mabley, and she's so awesome. She was a comedian who was born in the late 1800s in North Carolina, and at the time, women weren't really allowed to perform, so she ran away at 14 just to become a performer. And she joined what's called the Chitlin Circuit. So the Chitlin Circuit was this network of theaters throughout mostly the South and the East Coast where Black performers could travel from theater to theater and grow their audiences and make a name for themselves. So so in the 1920s, she was like driving on the Chitlin Circuit, and she literally came out as gay, and a lot of people think that she's the very first gay comedian. And so this is actually her in 1927, and this is where she got the name Moms from, because people were like, oh my God, you're so sweet like my mom, and then it just kind of stuck. And then, in the 1950s on the Chitlin Circuit, she came up with this character called Moms Mabley. So essentially she would play this old woman who just kind of spoke her mind, and this skyrocketed her into fame. So in the 1960s, she would often be asked to come onto talk shows to like just be her Moms Mabley character. And for context, the first Black man was sent to space like 2 weeks before this, and she was trying to convince the audience that she's the one who told the then sitting president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to make it happen.
I run out to Kennedy Airport, grabbed me an airplane, went down to Washington, and just as I was walking across the White House lawn, I spied him coming over from the House of Representatives. I said, hey, Lyndon. Lyndon, come here, boy. I say, get something up in the air quick. I'm telling you now, get something colored up in the air quick.
So she was so awesome for her time because she actually activated this thing that a lot of comedy theorists call the benign violation theory, which claims that for something to be funny, it has to meet these three very specific conditions. So it has to be benign, it has to be something that's considered harmless or safe, like being an old lady, and it has to meet a violation like taboo, sarcasm, in this case talking about race at a time where, like this, when she did this, Martin Luther King Jr. was still alive, so it was like very controversial to talk about race. And that equals benign violation, or so funny, and she was so awesome that she ended up becoming the very first woman to ever perform at the Apollo. And this is like actually Okay, now the science of shock and the comedian Joan Rivers. So Joan Rivers is so funny because I was introduced to her later in her career when she had this show I used to watch with my grandma called Fashion Police. And I did find that this next clip of her roasting a famous celebrity was very important for me to show. So
You live in a house made of straw or wood or bricks.
You need to graduate to adult book steering.
You're a bitch.
that was very important for this But a lot of people don't know that Joan Rivers is literally one of the main reasons that The Tonight Show is as big as it is today. So the Tonight Show hosts were kind of interesting because it started with Steve Carr in the 1950s, and then Jack Paar, and then it went to Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson made it so that each Tonight Show host that came after him would skyrocket into immediate comedy legacy. Because after Johnny Carson, it went Jay Leno, Conan for 7 months because Jay Leno wanted his job back. And then the Tonight Show host of my generation, Jimmy Fallon. So, Johnny Carson got to become who he was because Joan Rivers was on his show nearly every week because she was his permanent guest host. So whenever he couldn't perform, Joan Rivers would join the show. And she was super interesting because at the time, women weren't really on television, period, let alone late night TV, talking about things like sex or getting older. And so she had this bit that she would do on the Tonight Show called Can We Talk? And this is one of her monologues.
All that counts as sex appeal, am I right? Oh, look how quiet the room suddenly got. Oh, please. Oh, that's why I have no sex appeal, which kills me. The only way I can ever hear heavy breathing from my husband's side of the bed is when he's having an asthma attack. Oh, you don't know. Last night I said to my husband, what's your favorite sexual position? He said, next door. Hey! I have tried everything, because when I'm married now 14 years, I mean, at that point you have to, like, you know, think of things to do. I bought the book, The Joy of Sex, okay? And did you read that chapter 11, where you wrap yourself up totally in saran wrap? And oh yeah, great. And I laid down the dining room table, my husband came home, he said, leftovers again?
This was crazy at the time. Like, women were not talking like this on television, and so she like really changed the game for a lot of women that came after her and made it normal to talk about whatever you wanted. And that connects to the idea of social proof and what she did for a lot of women at the time, and that humans are biologically wired to look to other people to determine what's safe or correct or socially acceptable. And it's kind of like, I do this all the time in New York, like when you're walking in a crosswalk and it says don't walk, and then you just stand there, and then someone else starts walking, and you're like, oh yeah, I can do that too. So that's like literally what Joan Rivers was doing at the time for women in comedy. And she ended up becoming the very first woman to have her own late night show on television. But then after Johnny Carson stopped talking to her, because he was so jealous. But yeah, she's still like very historic. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the science of survival and Richard Pryor. So, Richard Pryor was born in the 1940s in Peoria, Illinois, and he had a very tumultuous childhood. It was just filled with like a lot of violence and a lot of drugs. So just like Mom's Mabley, who I talked about earlier, he ran away from home to pursue being a performer. And he found success relatively quickly. Like, he was an incredibly casual comedian, and he would talk about everything, and he would interact with the audience all the time, which was very unusual. And he found all this success. He was in The Wiz, he co-wrote Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks, and he had all these comedy albums, one of which won him a Grammy. But then in 1980, it was revealed that he set himself on fire in a drug incident. So he was doing drugs and accidentally burned 50% of his body. It was all over the tabloids, and a lot of people assumed that he would never return to comedy again, because how could you? And a year later, he actually came on Johnny Carson's show. Like, it was his emotional return back to television, and people just expected him to fade into obscurity after this, but he didn't. And in 1982, he released his famous comedy hour called Live on the Sunset Strip, and this is his bit about his freebasing incident called The Fire.
Now listen to me. All the people you ever heard of freebasing, have you ever heard of anybody blowing up? Why me? 10 million motherfuckers freebase, I gotta blow up. I'm talking about, I started out smoking freebase. It was like, I started out one time. And I should have known something bad was gonna happen. Because I remember the first time I did freebase, I burnt my bed up. I swear I was sitting on the side of the bed and somebody said, Richard, the bed's on fire. I said, what? The bed's on fire?
And this was really unheard of at the time, and it's hard to comprehend today how unusual this was, because at the time comedians were mostly about setup, punchline, and if they wouldn't talk about like real personal issues in comedy, but now that's commonplace. Everyone talks about personal strategies that impact how we think about situations. And what Richard Pryor did is he turned his trauma into art, and that art was within his stand-up comedy. Because when we talk about situations of hardship or we share stories about our struggles, it actually releases this chemical called oxytocin. which is called the love hormone. So it's kind of like if you receive a card from someone that you really love and you can feel it, like you don't have to physically be in the same room as a person to feel love from that. And that's what a lot of audiences took away from Richard Pryor's performance, was that he wanted to share his story and in that he shared the love. So in conclusion, I believe that, oh wait, hold on. Yeah, and then he was the first person to ever win the Mark Twain Prize for Humor. So like this is a big deal because this comedy award is like iconic, and he was the very first person to ever win. So in conclusion, the science of comedy is actually the science of all of us. It's the science of saying what you mean, even if you have to say it alone. It's the science of adapting to your environment and your generation to get your point across. It's the science of shocking others and normalizing everything about being human. And it's the science of turning pain into art. So thank you guys.